From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. And I'm here with Dr. Luke Griffith, Professor of History and Government at New Mexico Junior College, and more importantly, for our sake today, the author of Unraveling the Gray Area Problem, the United States and the INF Treaty. Luke, thanks for holding this up. We're already making you go to work here on the podcast. This is a very special podcast for us today as well, because Luke and I were postdoctoral fellows together a few years ago here at the Reagan Institute. So it's good for things to come full circle. Luke, welcome back home.
It is an absolute honor to be here. I wouldn't be here without the support of the Ronald Reagan Institute and you in particular, Anthony. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, you're buttering me up for some easy questions. Well, let's start with the book. I mean, the INF Treaty, it probably isn't, in everyday vocabulary for most people. So give me a sense of, open with a brief sketch of this controversy. What are the major turning points? What are the key issues at play?
The INF story really begins in 1976 when the Soviet Union deployed the first SS-20 road mobile intermediate range ballistic missile. And they deployed these on both sides of the Ural Mountains in the 1970s and early 1980s, eventually deploying up to 400 of these weapons. They had 3 independently targetable warheads. They could strike and destroy basically every single important military installation in NATO Europe within minutes. 1981, U.S. strategists predicted that a mere 100 SS-20s could get the job done.
So how does this make things different from the nuclear balance before 76? I mean, I think most of us we think about the Cold War and we think, nuclear apocalypse could happen at any time since basically Sputnik on forward. So what's different about these?
That's a great question. What they did is they created the gray area problem, the title of my book. Because of their intermediate range and nuclear capabilities, the SS-20s were not included in SALT or MBFR, about conventional weapons in Europe. So it creates an arms control problem for the United States and its European allies. And in addition to that, there's a strategic element of the issue too. The SS-20s were on launchers, they could fire and quickly relocate, and in a crisis, Western strategists, they feared that the United States and its allies would not be able to track and destroy these weapons in the field. So it was a major problem for the West.
So you talked about SALT, which was the major, what we call strategic arms limitation talks that really got going in earnest in the Nixon administration and carried on through Ford and through Carter. So these weapons are outside of SALT, theoretically unconstrained, creating real issues of alliance cohesion, I guess, between the United States and Europe. So certainly relevant for today as we talk about alliance unity. You'll share a little bit on that later, I'm sure.
That's right, Anthony.
Luke, you've really hit on this book, it seems, with a major moment, what I like to call a major historiographical moment, or rather a time where historians have zeroed in, and for our listeners in the know, they'll get that pun, have zeroed in on the importance of the INF controversy and kind of broader nuclear debates of the 80s. It's not just you or me. We talked about people like Susie Colburn, who's been on our sister podcast, Reaganism, and Stephanie Freeman, who's been on this podcast, and the Aarons, Donaghy, and Bateman, who've both written on kind of nuclear questions of the 80s. So how does your book kind of stand out?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's one that you need to be able to answer in order to publish on the topic in the first place. What makes your project unique? Why is it worth doing? I've learned I'm reluctant to characterize the work of my peers. It tends to offend people, so I'm going to characterize my own work and let you all draw the distinction. I think to publish a new book, you need to have a distinct approach. You need to have some sort of fresh evidence, and you need to develop novel arguments as well. So the approach of my book is a traditional U.S. foreign policy history. I look at it from 1977 until 1987, when the United States and its North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies devised and implemented the dual-track decision. It called for the deployment of 464 cruise missiles in Europe, 108 Pershing II ballistic missiles. They were supposed to be deployed in fall 1983, as well as concurrent arms negotiations with the Soviet Union that eventually lead to the INF Treaty. I was able to develop the personalities of the U.S. policymakers who were driving this story in a unique way, in large part because of the interviews I got to conduct, some of them with you at the Ronald Reagan Institute as a postdoctoral fellow, and also at the RAND Corporation.
I want to dive into some of those personalities, some of the more lively interview subjects that you were able to engage with as a postdoc at the Reagan Institute, which is a good selling point for the postdoc. Come to the Reagan Institute and you can interview the people who are involved in the decision-making process. So some of those lively interviews, who are some of the, or maybe the favorite people that you got to interview?
Honestly, I think for my story, the two interviews that stood out the most were the two that we actually conducted together. We got to interview Richard Burt, who was ambassador to West Germany and worked on the INF issues in the State Department. And then we got to interview the Prince of Darkness himself, Secretary of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Richard Pearl. And they allowed me to make arguments that I would never have been able to because that information was not in the archives. And I'll talk about it a little bit more here with the zero option. But for instance, Richard Pearl's quotes are just explosive. I mean, for instance, he said that, quote, the Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles were useless and they were not worth a damn. It is an argument that I spent some time investigating in the book. Richard Burt had great anecdotes about meeting with George Shultz and Paul Nitze after the famed walk in the woods anecdote where Shultz heard about Nitze's proposal and basically fell out of his chair and stuff like that. So some of it's substantive arguments I was able to make. Some of it's just color to the story.
Luke, you talked about interviews that mattered for this book. You know, one of the things that you and I were able to do, to my recollection, and I'm fairly comfortable making the assertion, maybe I'd be proven wrong, I believe you and I were probably the last two people on earth to interview Secretary George Shultz. Now, I know how that went for me. So how did that go for you?
One of my professors at Ohio University joked that I contributed to the demise of George Shultz by interviewing him. It's, of course, a joke, but he was incredibly helpful throughout the interview. And I was very impressed that he was willing to take the time to talk with the postdoctoral fellowship, especially at that late stage of his life. And he offered me some dynamite quotes that appear throughout the book. He called the INF Treaty a wonderful deal. He suggested that President Ronald Reagan was quite sincere about eliminating intermediate-range nuclear missiles and that the zero option was, quote, his way of getting the SS-20s out of Europe. So it played a big role in my research, and I think it also caught the eyes of publishers at Cornell as well.
So you mentioned two different proposals on the table during these INF debates, the walk in the woods and the zero option. I'm going to let you draw the story and the details and the color into those two different proposals, both of which are very controversial.
Yeah. Let's start with the zero option. The zero option is a U.S. proposal in November 1981 to eliminate U.S. and Soviet ground-based intermediate-range missiles. So it becomes the defining feature of the INF Treaty, and it's an argument that I develop in the book that other historians have not developed enough, in my opinion, which is that Reagan was super serious about it, and it became the central provision of the treaty. And second, it's a proposal that Richard Pearl advocated in the U.S. administration, and I develop in the book an argument that there were strategic benefits that previous scholars have not emphasized. The SS-20 program would have been killed with the zero option. And that's exactly what happened. And it could also be verified with on-site inspections. So one of the other options on the table throughout the INF story is sort of a global ceiling on US and Soviet missiles, where you have numerical limitations on how many you can deploy. And if that deal allowed even one SS-20, they can have an active program of testing and development. But under the zero option, that would have been eliminated. So that's an argument that I develop in the book as well.
Right. So very important that it kind of shuts out that latent capacity to reproduce intermediate range nuclear forces, or did shut down that latent capacity. We'll get to how well that position fared. Now, Walk in the Woods. Mm-hmm. This is the stuff of like real drama. I mean, there's a Broadway play called Walk in the Woods about this proposal, right?
There is. It's in my citation.
Why is this so dramatic? I mean, who was it? Alec Guinness? Obi-Wan?
I believe that's right.
Why is Obi-Wan Kenobi walking in the woods? What makes this thing so dramatic?
That's a great question. Thanks for teeing me up. Paul Nitze, he's assigned to be the chief negotiator in the INF talks. He's one of the most important nuclear minds in the United States throughout the Cold War. Paul Nitze is frustrated in summer 1982 because the INF negotiations opened almost a year ago and they've gone absolutely nowhere. And President Ronald Reagan has given Nitze clear directions. Do not stray from the zero option. But Nitze had experienced Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's exacting control during the SALT talks. He wanted to trade horses, and that's exactly what he did. So without authorization, him and the Soviet negotiator cruise up the mountains in a stylish Mercedes-Benz, and they craft a deal that, in my opinion, the Carter administration might have accepted.
Hold on, so it wasn't a walk? It was a cruise?
They cruised up to the top of the mountain, and I think they slowly walked around at the top of it.
Okay, well, they were getting a little older at the time, so that's right. That's high altitude for two men in their 70s to okay.
I think that the Carter administration might have taken the Walk in the Woods deal. It'll establish numerical limitations on U.S. and Soviet ground-based intermediate-range missiles. They might have balked at the fact that U.S. dual-capable aircraft were included, but so are the Soviets, and it's the kind of piecemeal deal that I think in the 1970s we see documentation that the Carter administration might have been enthusiastic about it. But Reagan would not accept it.
So I love that interjection right there. Reagan would not accept it. What we've seen in the literature lately is this idea of a Carter-Reagan continuity thesis, that basically Reagan was just a second-term Carter in matters of defense and in some other areas, regulation, for example, as well. But as you point out, one of the key differences between Reagan's approach to arms control and Carter's interested in limitations. Perhaps no fault of his own, that had traditionally been the way forward on arms control, limitations. Reagan's interested in reductions. And in the case of INF, total abolition. So tell me the difference between what a limitation and a reduction is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at the core of the INF treaty and the negotiations that bring it about. Limitations is what you see in the SALT deals. You cannot build up past this number of nuclear missiles. And in this case, with the Walk in the Woods deal, the Soviets would have had to dismantle some of the SS-20s in the field, but it would have left them with a significant number in Europe and Asia, more than enough to wreck every significant military installation in NATO Europe. In contrast, Reagan wants to significantly cut into and reduce the number of existing stockpiles on the table. And his strategy for doing that has been well outlined by someone like historian Beth Fisher. He wants to build up nuclear forces. He wants then to negotiate from a position of strength and trade those weapons away to end up with a net decrease in the number of nuclear weapons in the field.
Peace through strength, one of the key programs of the Reagan administration and also here at the Reagan Institute. Okay, so let's kind of move forward. You talked about the zero option, double zero. What's fascinating about your book is oftentimes the dual track decision the kind of arms control policies that emerged at the end of Carter and the beginning of the Reagan administrations are framed as a European initiative. Mm-hmm. And I'll stand up for Luke here about where he intervenes. I think you state pretty strongly against not all people in this field, but some people writing on this topic that, no, this is an American initiative, not a European initiative.
Yeah.
How do you see that develop?
Yeah, that is one of the major parts of chapters 1 through 3, which cover the Carter administration and the dual track decision that is quite different than the existing historiography. Previous historians have made 2 points about the origins of dual track that I don't agree with. First is that Carter is an ineffective leader of the North Atlantic Alliance, particularly on theater nuclear issues. I acknowledge that's the case with the neutron bomb, but I provide considerable evidence to show that the Carter administration learned from the neutron bomb fiasco, and during the consultations that wrought the dual track decision with its NATO allies, it asked for firm deployment commitments before asking Congress for the funds to develop those weapons. And timing those production and deployment decisions is something that current U.S. policymakers need to consider as well. The second point that I disagree with about the existing literature is that a lot of scholars have suggested that Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of West Germany was the chief architect of the dual track decision. And it's an argument I don't find a lot of credence for when you actually look at the language of the dual track document. It pretty clearly shows, and throughout those consultations leading up to it, the Carter administration persuaded NATO allies to accept its argument that even if negotiations with Moscow were successful, they still plan to deploy several hundred cruise missiles and Pershing IIs to Europe. That is not what the Reagan administration was going to do, and it's also not what Helmut Schmidt wanted. Helmut Schmidt called for a zero-option solution. He faced out an enormous amount of domestic political opposition at home in the Bundestag with the peace protests, and he wanted to dodge a basing debate by canceling the program if the Soviets were forthcoming in arms talks. And that is not what the NATO alliance agrees to in December 1979.
Okay, so let me triangulate things here a little bit and put some chronology in focus. So you're talking about Helmut Schmidt and what we call the no-lossing, right? Made famous in a survival article in, was it 77? So he advocates for essentially a zero option or double zero. Carter does not, and then Reagan does.
Yeah, that's one of the major things that separates the Carter and Reagan administration's approaches. It's the arms control track.
Yep.
They agree on the basing program. The Carter administration, the Reagan administration, they both agree that without concrete plans to put U.S. missiles in Europe, the Soviets aren't going to do anything in the talks. And yet it's somewhat ironic because Reagan has been portrayed in popular culture as more of a hawk than Carter, but he's going to break with Carter on the zero option.
Yep.
The Carter administration rejected it as a viable policy course. They thought that it would stonewall the talks, allow the SS-20 buildup to continue, and they looked to be right until March 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev assumes power in the Soviet Union, and Reagan's able to negotiate, as you said, the double zero option agreement with him.
So it's nice because, you know, I'll just say this. Here at the Reagan Institute, we generally like to think there's a difference between president number 39 and 40. Mm-hmm. And you've laid out the continuity between the two of them, but also the key changes between the two of them, which is really effective history, right? Everything is not always different, but everything is also not always the same. So that's really a part of the book that deserves applause, and kind of drawing those connections, but also those discontinuities. So we're now at a point. For decades, the INF Treaty had been hailed as the gold standard in arms control. Mm-hmm. The most successful arms control treaty ever, as you point out, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. But as of 2019, that's no longer the case. So walk me through the mechanics of the INF Treaty. First, why was it so durable for so many decades, for 3 decades? Mm-hmm. I mean, and then why did it fail? And is there any lesson that we should draw from it from today?
Yes to all three of the above, and I'll give you some of my short responses here. The INF Treaty, and I think it's right, you characterized it well, it was the gold standard of nuclear arms control. It eliminates a dangerous class of missiles. It eliminates over 400 SS-20s, which posed a dire threat to U.S. and Western security. It's verified with 600 or so on-site inspections that were totally unprecedented throughout the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union, and later Russia. And it provides momentum to sign subsequent arms deals like START, which are vital as well. The agreement unraveled for a couple of different reasons. Much of it was after I had written the dissertation and as I was doing research as a postdoctoral fellow at the RAND Corporation and the Ronald Reagan Institute. The first reason that it unraveled is the Russian government of Vladimir Putin cheated. They deployed, tested, and developed about 100 SSC-8 cruise missiles. Those weapons are an egregious violation of the treaty. The United States had contributed to the problem as well. It deployed ballistic missile defense systems to Europe, particularly in places like Romania and Poland, and that caused the Kremlin to grow quite anxious about its second strike capabilities, it appears. They were particularly concerned that some of these systems, the Aegis Ashore theater missile defense system in Romania and Poland, they feared that it could be rewired to fire ground-launched cruise missiles. And that's not something that the Trump or Biden administrations was ever able to convince the Putin government was not true. And third, people make policy, to sort of paraphrase Simon Miles, and the Trump administration was unwilling to tolerate the fact that the People's Republic of China was not included in this nuclear arms agreement. It viewed the INF Treaty as a relic of the bipolar Cold War. The INF Treaty did not impose limitations of any type on thousands of Chinese dual-capable INF-type missiles. And I do think that there are lessons that policymakers can learn and implement from the experience of negotiating the original INF Treaty as they seek to constrain Russian and Chinese missiles. One of the major lessons of the INF negotiations is that you want simple arms talks. The more systems, the more players that you ram into the negotiations, the more complicated that it gets. One of the major breakthroughs is when Gorbachev agrees to pursue a separate INF deal. And in my opinion, going forward, the United States should think about bilateral deals with Russia and China that control separate types of weapons.
So not a trilateral agreement. So the era of bilateral arms control for you is alive and well, or should be.
I think it's worth pursuing. I think that the idea of going after something totally unprecedented involving a country like China that showed absolutely no willingness to go to the negotiating table is a long shot, and probably more of a long shot even than what I advocate in the conclusion of my book. I think another lesson is you got to have something to trade for what you want. Now, the Biden administration needs to give serious thought to, is it seeking to station these ground-based Tomahawks and SM-6s on Allied soil? The Army and the Marines have these weapons in the field right now. I was reading the news about it this morning. They have no agreements with countries in the first island chain, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. They're very reluctant to host those missiles. So right now it appears that they're headed to places like Guam, and that in a crisis, the United States might deploy ground-based Tomahawks and SM-6s into those countries for a temporary amount of time. In my opinion, this is not the ideal policy course. It could escalate the crisis by moving the missiles there. They're going to take a long time to get there, and that might not be opportunistic. And they're going to be sitting ducks on Guam. It's a small island. They do not have room to move around, and they are vulnerable to Chinese preemption. And I think that another lesson is that you need to understand the unique context of today. You're not just taking the plays from the 1980s and putting them into the 2020s. The U.S. officials aren't going to be talking with Gorbachev, who shared Reagan's dream of a nuclear-free world. The Russian economy was terrible in the 1980s. It encouraged Gorbachev to compromise on INF issues. That's not the case with China today either. And given the number of states that have ground-based ballistic and conventional cruise missiles, I don't think that Beijing and Moscow are going to abolish that entire class of missiles under a new zero option either. So I do think there are lessons to learn from the past, but I think it's important to remember today's unique context as well.
Another interesting flip that you probably talk about in a little book or should be drawn out is in the 80s, if you recall, it was the Russians, it was the men in the Kremlin who said French and British systems should be included in a deal with the United States. So they were really talking about four-way talks. And ultimately, that doesn't come to pass. So it goes down to the bilateral situation, which is, again, what you're advocating for.
Yeah.
So, again, another lesson. All right. I think we've reached that time where we get to our hints for history section of the talk. First, what archive? What source are we really undervaluing or was extremely valuable for you?
Yeah, I think for historians of U.S. foreign relations, the historians don't always make the connection to go to the British National Archives. And in my opinion, that was one of the most robust sources of resources for this topic. In large part, it's because the British declassify nuclear documents faster than we do in the United States. And I found memorandums of conversation from every important NATO meeting in the British National Archives. I found British discussions with the West Germans. I found U.S. documents that weren't available within the United States. And the British are just fabulous at taking notes as well. They're at the important NATO meetings. They're taking notes. And I think that's a resource that I would encourage future historians to mine is the British National Archives.
I have to say I had the same experience at Kew. And I chuckle when you say the British are good at taking notes. Might be a very American perspective, but I would agree. But a great case for multinational research, even if you're doing a U.S. foreign policy perspective, getting those declassified documents and other archives and also those perspectives of the same meetings and happenings. So that's awesome. Okay, Luke, you have a graduate student knocks on your door and says, Professor Griffith, I need a dissertation topic, or, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. What would you tell me they should look into?
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much of maybe what my second topic
what's the other thing you would tell them to look into?
I don't mind sharing this one. I think that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there is a pressing need to examine U.S. policy towards the denuclearization of Ukraine in the 1990s. I think it's an issue that has a lot of contemporary relevance. I've not seen a lot of academic studies about it, and you're also going to be writing that new wave of declassified documents that's just coming out. So for me, that's a topic that would check a couple of boxes to get publishers, people who fund postdoctoral fellowships interested in your research.
Very interesting, too, about what does a security guarantee mean? And does a security guarantee equal deterrence? Okay, all right. Well, that's the next book. We'll have you on in a few years to talk about that one. Once again, Luke, thanks for coming on to discuss this book. It's really come full circle, Unraveling the Gray Area Problem, the United States, and the INF Treaty. Pick it up on Amazon, Cornell University Press, or anywhere else you might buy your books. Thanks, Luke.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.